Welcome to the Hive, everybody, and we're going to have a fun show today. We're going to talk about this guy right here. Do you know this guy with the Penhall Company logo on his front? I took that picture when I was in high school. I was taking a photography class, and Bruce was writing, I think it was a USA versus the World, and here's Bobby Boogaloo Schwartz, his world's pairs champion, playing around, and I took a photo shot of them goofing off at Costa Mesa, California during a practice session. Bruce was testing out that outside line for the race that night. Today, we're going to talk about Bruce Penhall, but not so much fast that way, but we're going to talk about his early days when he was born. He was born in May 10th, 1957 in Anaheim, California. He was from Anaheim. That's actually next to Disneyland. So I bet Bruce was at Disneyland, the happiest place on earth. And that's exactly where he was born. And his parents were LeRoy and Barbara Penhall. They were very nice people, his parents, and they were good. LeRoy, the dad, he started the Penhall Company the same year that Bruce was born in 57. And he used to have a concrete sawing business. And it was during the Orange Grove development boom. They had a need for that because they started making more roads, more construction. And he saw that. He was a smart guy, LeRoy was. And he went ahead and he built that business from scratch. He bought his first concrete saw. It was a gas-powered diamond saw, which actually, evolved into the higher concrete solutions, including the concrete scanning, cutting, sawing, and breaking and removal of the concrete. So LeRoy was really doing everything, but he just started small and kept growing and growing. By 1963, the Penhall Company had 13 employees. So from 57 to 63, he started to grow. And they were mostly breaking concrete and doing those kind of jobs for the Penhall Company. So that was really great. And in the 70s, they kept getting bigger and bigger. The Penhall Company actually expanded. They had an office in Anaheim, California, where Bruce was born. And they went ahead and expanded to offices like in Riverside, California, Camarillo, Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Diego, California. They had offices everywhere. LeRoy was a real smart guy, and I think he had a partner too. So that was really great. And his dad, like I say, LeRoy, was born in May, the same month that Bruce was born, but not the same year. I don't think it was the same year. It was 1930, and he was born on the 23rd of May that year. So LeRoy was, he lived about 44 years total. And he had a love for speedboats and airplanes. He loved those racing boats, and that's where actually they met the Sigaloses, and he actually learned to fly and was a really good pilot. So in 1962 and 1963, LeRoy set a world record for the boat racing in his class. So he was a speedboat racer. I wonder where Bruce Penhall got that in his blood. I think it was from LeRoy. So that was good. And he went ahead and learned the boat racing and got really good with boats. And he actually had a crash one time, LeRoy. He had a crash, and he actually almost tore his foot off, believe it or not. And it was a bad crash, and he was in the hospital, and it was just a terrible situation. And actually, that's where he met Dennis Sigalos' dad, as they were boat competitors. They were like kind of like Bruce and Dennis was when they were racing speedway. LeRoy and Dennis's dad, they were actually competing against each other as younger racers in the boats. So there's kind of a racing blood in the Sigalos and the Penhall blood. So that was pretty cool. So they went ahead and they were real racers at that time. And he had that really horrible crash, but they went ahead and had like close family, get-togethers. They played cards, they partied, they had a good time. And then Mr. Sigalos, he brought Dennis over like to the Penhall house, and they enjoyed, hanging out together and playing around as kids do. So it was really cool, and they had a good time together when they were kids. And then LeRoy actually loved flying airplanes. Bruce's dad, LeRoy, was an airplane pilot, and he was racing. He liked to race. I wonder where Bruce Penhall got that racing blood from. LeRoy, his dad. And they went ahead and raced the P-51 Mustang fighter plane. Now, if you don't know what a P-51 Mustang fighter plane is, it's a really cool plane. It's like a fighter plane they used to do in World War II, I think it was. I don't know. I wasn't born. But it was a really cool, like, gray plane with a star on it. And it raced really fast. And they would race, I guess, low in the desert over in the Mojave. And then they would race really fast. And then they would just go ahead and race. And then they would have like a 10-lap race. It was a 10-mile course, 10 laps. So it was like 100 miles. So that was really cool. They were like racing low near the ground. And it was really exciting racing. And that's where LeRoy got to learn how to, just continue to race, from his boats to his airplanes. He had really fun, expensive taste in his racing. He wasn't racing motorcycles so much. He was racing the expensive toys. And that was really neat. Like he really had a good time with his airplanes, and he did really good. One time I was reading that LeRoy, he actually had airplane lessons from this instructor. And the instructor said to LeRoy, "Hey, LeRoy, you're never going to be good as a pilot. You don't know how to fly. You're a bad pilot. You're going to be a bad racer." And LeRoy was really angry, that he paid money to have instructions. And then the instructor told LeRoy, like, "You're never going to be successful." And LeRoy's like, "Oh, yeah, I can do that." So one time he had this race in the Mojave, and he went ahead and kicked his instructor's butt. I mean, he just like wiped him out. And I heard LeRoy gave him the bird, he's like, "Goodbye," and he gave him the bird. Oh, that's good. The racing competitor, the fire runs deep in the Penhall blood. And LeRoy would sound like a character, a really great guy. So that was what happened. And he went ahead and got the best of his instructor. And that was really good. And Bruce was born and raised primarily in Anaheim, California. And at the age of 14, approximately 14, 13, 14, who cares? He went ahead and relocated to Balboa Beach, California. Do you know Balboa Beach, California? That is a cool place. Balboa is really neat. It's near Newport Beach. It's really beautiful. They have nice surf, and it's just a good place to hang out, especially in the summer. There's lots of gorgeous women, in the summer. It's full of people, but it's really nice. Balboa is a great place to grow up. I mean, it's really amazing down there at the beach. So that's exactly where he grew up, and he hung out with the Sigalos family. Dennis Sigalos and his mom and dad and the Penhalls were all like good friends, and they hung out, and it was really good. And also today, Bruce Penhall, he hangs out sometimes with Dennis Sigalos, and their kids hang out. So it was like Bruce Penhall's mom and dad, they hung out with Sigalos' mom and dad. And then later it was Penhall hanging out with Dennis, and Bruce's kids and Dennis's kids became friends and hanging out. So it's kind of, they kind of like did it in that chain. I thought that was really neat, that they did that. And it gave Bruce and Dennis's family this really good bond, like they bonded together. And Bruce was just, I think, 2 years older, because Bruce, I think, said 3 years older, but Dennis was born in 59 and Bruce was born in 57. So Bruce is probably like 2 years older or so than Dennis. Not that far. They're close in age. And they hung out together as little children. They used to play around, and they used to go bike riding. I guess Dennis had this garage that went down, Bruce was saying, And then I guess the garage was really slick. In America, sometimes they make those garages like slippery. And so the boys would go down the hill, Dennis and Bruce, and then they would go to the bottom into the garage. I think it's Dennis's house. I'm not sure. Maybe it's Bruce. But they go to the bottom of the garage and then they power slide like speedway with, because this ground was so slippery, they could actually do some sliding. So they did that for a little while, and that was fun. They really had a good time doing that, power sliding in the garage. And then probably, I don't know if this is true, Bruce never really told me, but I always picture them like going around Balboa Beach. There's a pier down there. There's a Balboa Beach pier. And I always picture them like power sliding and like goofing off. And you know, I could just picture them like power sliding at the pier, the Balboa Pier, and maybe a little old lady standing there, and then Bruce running and Dennis sliding into the, like near the lady, and the lady falling down. Ah! And then Bruce is like, "Oh, sorry, lady." And the lady looks up at Bruce and goes, "What did you do?" And Bruce is like, "Well, I'm preparing. We're both preparing to be in the '82 World Championship on the podium. I'm going to be the world champion, and Dennis is going to be on the podium with me. So sorry, lady, we're just having a little fun. You know, we're kids. We do that when we're children." So I can just picture Bruce like being a holy terror, you know, as a kid. I mean, he had to be. Dennis was saying that they really had a lot of fun. They didn't do anything to like go to jail, but they were like having a lot of fun. So that was really neat. They probably just had a good time together. And LeRoy, he dabbed in racing motorcycles, I guess earlier in his career when maybe he didn't have as much money. And I guess he was a racer a little bit. He rode bikes and he kind of dabbled in it. And he enjoyed actually speedway motorcycle racing. Do you know what speedway motorcycle racing is? I bet you know. Speedway. And LeRoy went to the Costa Mesa Fairgrounds where they had the speedway races. And he enjoyed watching it. Probably like 1969 or the revival of the speedway. And you had Rick Woods, and then Steve Bass was a champion in '69 and 1970. Rick the Rocket Woods became United States champion at the Costa Mesa Speedway. And I don't know about that time, give or take a little bit, LeRoy and Dennis's dad, they went ahead and sponsored the Rocket, Rick Woods. And so Rick Woods had a lot of sponsors, including the Penhalls, the Sigaloses. He had Ed Schaefer as his chief mechanic. He was amazing, Ed Schaefer. And he had, you know, all these sponsors, Premier helmets, and I mean, the list goes on and on. Everybody wanted to sponsor Rick Woods because he was really famous at the early days of Speedway. It was his heyday. He was really great, and he was a legend. So everyone wanted to get a piece of Rick Woods, including the Sigalos and the Penhall family. So they went ahead and sponsored Rick, and then Bruce's dad had his first taste of Speedway about that time. And their dad was involved in the Speedway, and he loved Speedway. He loved the races. It was good. You know, Speedway at Costa Mesa in the early days was great. You had the smell of the castor oil. You had the mud flying into the stands. You had the excitement. You had Bill Cody, and you know, you had the Bass brothers and Rick Woods, and you had all this excitement, all these great riders. And then you had like fights in the stands, and you had all the girls going there, and then it was packed full of people. There was like 6,000-7,000 people or more. It was everybody went Friday night to the Costa Mesa Speedway. It was a lot of fun. That's why Bruce's dad, he had a good time. And then I guess he brought young Bruce and Dennis to the races, and they're like, we like that one. So Bruce and Dennis got a little taste as children of the Speedway at Costa Mesa, and they was like, we want to go ahead and like learn to ride this thing. And they were really excited. And Bruce and Dennis had their first Speedway bike, and it was actually a junior Speedway bike. Back then, I think they called it a mini Speedway. And I don't know if this is true, but I don't know if anyone before Bruce and Dennis had these mini speedway bikes, because they weren't even like around back in those early days before they invented water. No, I'm just joking. I wasn't that old, but they didn't have the junior speedway bikes back in those days. And Bruce and Dennis, probably like, Dad, please get us a junior speedway bike. We want one. And then LeRoy and company said, okay. So they went ahead and they had Ed Schaefer, the sponsor of Rick Woods. They were all connected friends. They had Ed Schaefer build the boys their own speedway bikes. It had to be made from scratch, like the bikes, they didn't have speedway back in those days. So they had to actually create those bikes. And Ed Schaefer, he designed the junior speedway bike, probably shrunk the frame a little bit. I'm sure Dennis was just and Bruce were just young teenagers. So they had to actually chop down the speedway bike and make it a little smaller to fit the boys. And then Ed didn't know what the engine to put in it, because these guys were like little. So he went ahead and got this 2-stroke McCulloch chainsaw engine, and he put it in this junior speedway bike. He made it all fit because there was no junior speedway bikes at that time. And Ed Schaefer was smart. I met Ed Schaefer, and he was like a genius, and his shop was beautiful over there off the 55 freeway in Costa Mesa. And it was just really beautiful. And Ed Schaefer was a real mastermind, and he was a smart guy. He made Rick Woods a national champion, so he was pretty good. And he made the boys their first junior mini speedway bike back in the day. And it might have been the first junior speedway bike. I don't know, but I never heard of one before. Ed Schaefer built that for Bruce and Dennis. So that was a pretty neat piece of history. Bruce Penhall and Dennis Sigalos may have had the first mini junior speedway bike ever in the United States of America. And that was pretty cool. And they just went ahead and they had the bike made, but they had this bike, and then they needed a track. They needed to have a track. And then they went ahead and had George Wynn. Do you know George Wynn? George Wynn was the guy that went to like Ivan Majors, and he was a tuner for Ivan. And he told Ivan after his second world championship, he said, Ivan, if you win the third championship, I will take that bike and I will gold plate it for you and make a beautiful gold bike and just win that world championship. So Ivan, he took on the challenge from George Wynn and his partner, and Ivan went ahead and won his third world championship. And Ivan said, okay, George, here's my bike. So George went ahead and flew that bike all the way over to the United States, and he had it gold plated. The bike is really beautiful. It probably cost a couple dollars. And he sent that bike all the way back, I guess, to England or New Zealand. He sent that back to Ivan Major, and Ivan proudly displayed that beautiful the third time world championship bike. And it was really beautiful. You see those pictures on the internet if you look. And George Wynn was the mechanic, and he did all that. So Mr. Penhall and Sigalos, they went up to George Wynn, who was a genius guy. I mean, this guy was Mr. Speedway from England. He worked on my bikes before, and George was smart. And he was just an old man that used to just kind of like work out of his garage. He was a cool guy, and he was really smart. And he was kind of like, like who's who of the Speedway in the early American days. George Wynn was really known. If you didn't know George Wynn, like where were you? Because he was pretty famous mechanic. So the Penhalls and Sigalos hired George Wynn to build the boys a speedway track, do the crash wall, and do the starting gate and everything. So George went ahead and built a mini speedway track. Dennis's dad, he owned Orange County Food Services. It was a catering business. They had a whole bunch of trucks, and it was a really big business. I think they sold it. They had like 1 acre of land that was just sitting there in the back in Anaheim, California. And George Wynn went ahead, I guess, and brought the dirt in and built the crash wall, and it's probably the size of like Costa Mesa or something. And they went ahead and did all that, and it was really neat. So the boys had a practice track to ride on. Thank you, George Wynn, who had since passed away. He was kind of an old guy at the time, but he was genius. George Wynn was an awesome guy, and he built the starting gate, like for Costa Mesa, and then he built it for the Penhall and Sigalos. And I mean, those guys had their own speedway track, and the boys, they practiced like every day. They'd go to the speedway track and they would ride after school and ride on Saturday and Sundays, and all summer long, they were just practicing and riding. I asked both Bruce and Dennis, like, who won, you or Bruce or Dennis, which one? And Dennis and Bruce didn't really say much, but they liked to practice and, just have practice. They were friends, so they weren't really like trying to beat each other, really. They were just having a good time on the speedway bike, and that was really fun. They had a good teenage years of just practicing and stuff like that. And at the age of 14, Dennis and I, Sigalos is the same age, and I was actually saving up for my first speedway bike. I wasn't lucky to have my own speedway track. I had to work as a paper boy and for the Orange County Register. That's kind of embarrassing. I don't want to say that, but it's true. And one day I was like just kicking back, looking at the sports page. I used to like looking at all the sports and then seeing the speedway results at Costa Mesa every Saturday morning from Friday night. And I saw this clipping of Dennis Sigalos. This was a young Dennis Sigalos. He was riding at the Orange County Raceway, and they went ahead. He was 13 years old. It said Dennis Sigalos of Fullerton made believers of the fans and riders alike at the OCIR and the mini motorbike program. And he went ahead. I guess he was racing that night. Dennis Sigalos was racing as a young boy at like 13. And I was delivering newspapers trying to save my money for a speedway bike. And Dennis, I cut this out of the paper. This is actually the paper from back in the day. I saved this. I was so jealous of Dennis because I was like, God, Dennis has a speedway bike and he's my age. Dennis was my age. Bruce was a couple years older. But Dennis had this speedway bike and he was in the Orange County Register. You see that, the register there in 73 or something like that. So Dennis was a speedway bike rider when he was like a young teenager. That's not fair. Dennis was on the show before Christmas, and Dennis went ahead and showed me this picture. He had to show me. I guess he had won the main event at the OCIR, and Dennis was only like 13. He was just a little kid. And the trophy girl was like 20 or 25 years old, this big, tall, 6 foot tall girl. And then Dennis was about, 5 feet or something. He was just a 13-year-old kid, so he was maybe smaller than 5 feet. And then Dennis had to step on a stool or climb a ladder or something. So I guess for the trophy girl, I guess he had to climb a ladder for kissing, and then the girl got arrested for child abuse. No, just joking. No, she didn't get arrested. That was a stupid joke. And so anyways, Dennis was racing speedway at 13 and 14. And then Bruce, young Bruce Penhall, he was 2 years older, and he turned 16 years old when Dennis was 14, and Dennis was winning all those races at the OCIR. And Bruce had to move into D3. His first race, I thought Bruce actually went into D2, Division 2, the intermediate class. But they went ahead. Bruce said that he was put in the D3. And so his first race was in D3. And Bruce said he cleaned their clocks. And he won the main event. Would that surprise you, Bruce Penhall winning the main event, D3? I would like to see that race. That would have been fun. But I didn't see that one. I wasn't there. But Bruce went ahead and quickly moved to D2 after that D3 win in his early days. And he just went ahead and, started doing really well. And Dennis also was winning main events, like I say, at the OCIR at the same time Bruce was winning main events in the big time. Because in Speedway in America, you have to be 16 years old to actually race Speedway. That's kind of their rules. I wish they didn't have that rule. It'd been better if they were just any age. But they had to wait until they were 16. And then Bruce went first, and then Dennis had to go second. And that's exactly how that worked out. And then anyway, so they went ahead, and Bruce went ahead and raced D2 for just a short period of time. I can only see him there like 1 week or 2 weeks. And I saw a picture of Bruce when he was racing like D2. He had that blonde hair and he had long, and he was kind of a cool looking dude. And I love that. I was looking for that picture. I can't find it. I'm looking for it. And he was just a cool, like 16-year-old kid, young rider who had a lot of experience from that practice track. And so that was kind of cool. And then Bruce went ahead and moved to D1 pretty quick. He didn't stay in D3 and D2 very long. D2 is for the intermediate riders. And so anyway, so Bruce went ahead and was riding in D1 really fast. And he was moved up to the big time. Bruce was racing D1 very fast as a 16-year-old boy. And he was racing all the top guns. He was racing like Bill Cody, Sonny Nutter. He was racing Danny Becker. He was racing all those legends. And Bruce was holding his own. And I asked Bruce, I said, did anyone help you? And he said a couple guys helped him, like, I don't know, Ed Williams and a few other guys. But most of the riders didn't want to help Bruce because they knew that he was like an up-and-coming rider. And Bruce was a danger or a threat to them. So Bruce had to learn it all on his own without a whole bunch of help. And so that's exactly. But the thing is Bruce became an instant success. And I bet a lot of these other riders, maybe not all, but a lot of the riders are probably jealous of Bruce because Bruce was really an amazing rider and he was very famous first. I mean, he just came up as like the golden boy and he actually rode really good to like prove it. So Bruce was an amazing rider and he just kind of stepped up. He was like a star at the beginning, which probably made a lot of these old timers mad because they're, everyone's working really hard and then Bruce just comes up and, boom, he became kind of famous fairly fast. So that was really good. And then his success and his fame just started getting bigger and bigger, really young at like, maybe 17 or something. Bruce just started becoming a famous rider. He had those handsome, the looks, and he just really was really, amazing. And, he had the looks and then he was a great rider. So Bruce Penhall had it all. He had the riding and he had the looks. So that was really great. And so it just kept getting better and better. And Bruce was grooming for success. He's grooming for his future as a legend in Speedway. It was really neat, his progression. And at Costa Mesa Speedway, and maybe the other tracks, especially Costa Mesa, every year they used to have the Fox Night. And they used to name it after Bruce Penhall. Bruce the Fox Penhall. That was the nickname that the announcer, Larry Huffman, gave Bruce. And then the other announcer, Flanders, Bruce Flanders, he gave Bruce the nickname Juicy Brucey. Juicy Bruce. I like Bruce the Fox, probably. If that was me, I would probably take the Fox better than Juicy Brucey. That sounds kind of funny to me, but Bruce was mostly known as the Fox because he was really a good-looking guy. And that's exactly how it worked out. And he just became an instant success, like a celebrity rider. Bruce Penhall was going up to the top really fast and probably making a few of those guys a little jealous along the way. I don't know that, but I speculate that from what I know about the Speedway riders in California. And while he was young, Bruce actually was rising to stardom, and he attended high school at Newport Harbor high school in Newport Beach. Do you know Newport Harbor High School? I didn't go there, but I know that name. And it's in the Newport School District. And Bruce probably had a lot of fans at school because he was famous. Costa Mesa and Newport Beach is really close to each other. So a lot of those people, a lot of his friends, the girls, and everybody probably just went to the races because they live so close to Newport Beach, California. And that was really cool. And then LeRoy and Bruce's dad, they went ahead and they just told Bruce that, like, if your grades go down, you're not going to race speedway no more. So Bruce's fame was growing, and probably Bruce didn't really care about school that much, because that's how most of us young boys were, including me. We don't care about the school that much, and then we're like having the stardom as a speedway rider. But Bruce's dad, LeRoy, said, Bruce, if your grades go down, that speedway bike will be taken away from you, and you're not going to race speedway no more. So Bruce was like, what? You can't do that. I'm becoming a famous. And so Bruce's dad said, hey, I don't care, You're going to do your grades, and you're going to pass, and you're going to make your papa proud of you. So Bruce realized at a young age that his dad was instilling these principles of hard work and study. Bruce couldn't be a slacker, even though he probably was a little bit. But Bruce really knew that he had to keep his grades up, not because he wanted to, maybe, but because he wanted to race the speedway bike. And he wanted to keep the dad from taking his bike away. So Bruce, had to do that. And also, as Bruce's popularity grew in Southern California, Bruce's dad became a little concerned because I think he was like 16, 17 years old. And Bruce's dad bought him this van that said Penhall Company on it. And he just became really famous. And LeRoy, being the good father he was, he went ahead and he hired this friend of his who was an Anaheim police officer. And he hired him to kind of like watch Bruce, maybe like a bodyguard, but I don't think it was a bodyguard. I think it was so that Bruce didn't get into trouble, like he wasn't drinking after the races, maybe making trouble, maybe getting arrested or something. So Bruce's dad, LeRoy, who loved his son Bruce, went ahead and hired his friend, who was an Anaheim PD officer, to kind of like watch Bruce and make sure that he was a good boy. Because I think Bruce is a little bit like wild guy, like fun, and he needed a little bit of a leash around his neck. He needed a leash, and that Anaheim police officer was the leash that Bruce Penhall probably needed. So that was kind of actually ingenious of LeRoy to go ahead and hire this police officer to go ahead and monitor and watch the wild Bruce Penhall as a teenager. I can only imagine. I think Bruce went to an invitational once. It was in Salt Lake City. I think Bruce was there, and he was hanging out with like Harry Oxley and a bunch of guys like that. I had another group. I was racing that too. And Bruce was really wild. I think they got really crazy. And once Bruce broke away from the police officer, it was like, hey, Bruce is going to have fun. And so Bruce, I think it was at Salt Lake at the Cow Palace. They used to race it. They had a big invitational. And I raced that. I won my first race, and then I lost everything else after that. I think Mike Faria won that race. But Bruce, I think, was at that race, if I'm not mistaken. And I think Bruce was pretty wild, and he was kind of a crazy guy. And we were all wild. I mean, I can tell you some funny stories, but I better not, because maybe I'll get in trouble. I was just as bad as Bruce. We're all like troublemakers. All speedway riders were troublemakers. I mean, we were all getting in trouble, and we were having lots and lots of. We never got arrested, thank God, but we really were like a handful. We really were trouble. So Bruce, I think, was no different. We're all the same. There's no difference. And so that's what happened. And Bruce was riding like 5 nights a week, when he's racing speedway. Costa Mesa was the granddaddy, but there was like Tuesday night at Ventura, which is really far. And then you'd get home at like 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning. And then you'd have to go to school the next day. I actually did the same thing. I was racing the same time with Bruce. And it was hard. I was in high school at the same time. And, I had to come home late at night and then wake up and be at school at like 8:15 in the morning that Wednesday. And I was tired, racing, driving 2 or 3 hours home, and then waking up early, like 7 o'clock in the morning to be at school at 8 o'clock. Oh man. So Bruce was doing that 5 nights a week. And I did it too when I was the D1 rider. And it was really hard, like going to high school. And then Bruce was more famous than I was, but it was still hard for everybody. It didn't matter who you were, really, going to school. And then Wednesday night was San Bernardino. They had the fairgrounds, the Orange Showgrounds at San Bernardino. And then they had Thursday night at the Irwindale Speedway, which is gone now. And they have a Miller Brewing Company over there. And I kind of wish they'd not have the brewing company. They just have the Speedway track back. Those are the good old days of Irwindale. And that was Thursday. And so it wasn't that far, like an hour or so. And then Bruce would have to come home and go to school on Friday morning from the Thursday night races, and me too. But it wasn't that bad. Like next to Ventura was really hard because it was Tuesday night. But Friday, I guess, was okay because, the weekend was coming. And Costa Mesa was coming up on Friday night. So that was really exciting. And then Saturday nights, back in the day, they raced at Bakersfield. And do you know Bakersfield? That's way up north. Saturday night, so at least when you come home, I guess, that it's okay because it's Sunday. You can sleep. It's a long drive from Balboa, from Orange County, all the way to Bakersfield. It's kind of a long drive. They have a track now. Steve Evans is running Bakersfield. So Bakersfield is back, and they have a new track now. And they're going to start racing in February this year in 2021. So that's something to look forward to. And like I say, so Bruce actually got his credits for his high school. I didn't know this until Bruce was on the show the other night, that there's a program, I forgot the name of it, but in high school, if you wanted to, you could actually do extracurricular projects, and then you could earn credits for those projects. And then maybe you didn't have to go to those classes. So I bet Bruce really picked his first period classes, and so he could do those projects, and then he didn't have to wake up so early and go to those classes. But I don't know. But Bruce did a lot of those things. One time, I guess he went to the Grand Canyon or something, and then he had to hike all the way down, which is 20 miles or something. And then he had to collect samples of rocks and plants or whatever for environmental. And then he had to maybe write a paper or something. And then he had to walk all the way back up or something, the Grand Canyon. That's far, that's worth 3 credits right there. And then he got to have a passing grade in his class by doing these different kinds of things, which I wish I had that, because I would have done that for sure. But Bruce was doing that kind of thing and getting a lot of credits. That was great. And so he was able to have some benefits from that. And also, when I was young, I had my first race against Bruce Penhall. I was talking to Bruce yesterday or a couple days ago about my chain guard falling down and almost hitting him in the head. I thought Rick Woods was in my first race. He might have been, but here, this was a race. What race was this? Oh man, is this the right program? Maybe it's the wrong program. I got the wrong program. It was race 5, or excuse me, event 16. Oh, they're doing the racing. They're doing the Los Angeles Sprockets versus the Orange County Eagles. And then they had handicap races. And I was in event 16. Bruce was racing all night long. And here's the program in event 16. Bruce Penhall was on the 50. Yeah, Bruce Penhall was a 50-yard line rider. And I was down at the bottom at the 0-yard line, my first time in D1. And Bruce went ahead and he beat me at the finish line. Bruce Penhall, I was winning him and I bobbled and Bruce took me, you know, at the very last by like 1 inch and he beat me. So that was pretty good, you know, to get beat by Penhall your first race wasn't so bad, but I wanted to beat him. And, you know, Bruce is a great rider and he doesn't like to be denied at all. And I actually had a chance to race against Dennis Sigalos in my first D3 race a couple of years ago in event number 11. And here's the program from that race with Siggy, event number 11. Where is that? There's Dennis, number 228, on the 10-yard line. Dennis was a D3rd division, and I was number 339 on the 0-yard line. That was my first Division 3 race, and Dennis had his first Division 3 race the same time as me. So I raced Dennis, my first 3rd division race, and I raced Bruce Penhall, my first division race, and that was a lot of fun. And just, you know, I got beat just by 1 inch by Bruce, and that was a lot of fun. I mean, that was cool. And then Dennis like blew everybody away, and Dennis was a great rider. So Dennis went ahead and just smoked everybody's doors off. It was really, really cool. And so anyways, they had like this team racing. And actually that night that I raced Bruce, they actually raced the Orange County Eagles. Bruce Penhall was on the Los Angeles Sprockets. And I don't know if you can see Bruce's name there. Mike Bass, Steve Fortune, Steve Colombo. Bruce Penhall, number 1. I'm sorry. Steve Fortune, Steve Colombo, Rob Morrison, Mike Bass, Gene Woods, and Craig Schaefer was the reserve. Bruce Penhall, number 45, was on the Los Angeles Sprockets team riding. And the Orange County Eagles had a good team, but they ended up last place. They had Billy Gray, Alan Christian, Bill Cody, Jan Ballard, Rick Woods, good rider, and Mike Montaigne and Ron Rose as a reserve. So the Orange County Eagles in Costa Mesa, California, they had a good team, but they ended up last. And the Los Angeles Sprockets, led by Mike Bass and Bruce Penhall, they went ahead and ended up 2nd place in that league. That was the only year that they had the team racing. And on the other side of that program was my first race against Bruce Penhall there on Heat 16. I forgot that they were racing the team racing back then. And I got 2nd place, and Bruce Penhall got 1st, and Wild Bill Cody got 3rd place. So that was pretty cool. So we had a good time. And Bruce, he went ahead and he had a really good year on that Los Angeles Sprockets team. It was called the Los Angeles Sprockets, but it was the Irwindale team. I always like to say the Irwindale Sprockets, but it was actually the Los Angeles Sprockets. And Bruce ended up the season number 2 in points. He was only like a 2nd-year rider at that time, and he ended up number 2 in points with like over 11 points average. Bruce Penhall was like almost a rookie, and he was number 2 out of all the riders in points, which was pretty amazing. And his mentor, Mike Bass, he finished 1st in points with over a 13-point average. He only raced 4 races, possible 12 points, plus the winners had the semi and a main, and then they had their own kind of main, so you could actually pick up 15 points if you were really good and you got into that main. So Mike Bass, he averaged 13 over that, and Bruce Penhall, he averaged over 11 to be number 2 in that it's called the National Speedway League, and Bruce Penhall was really amazing. I talked to Bruce, and then he said that, you know, having Mike Bass as his mentor during that race was actually one of the biggest blessings in his life, because Mike Bass he won 7 United States championships in the 70s. He was the king of speedway. He won 70% of the United States nationals in the 70s. He was an amazing rider. And then his brother Steve won 1 in 74. So the Bass brothers won 80% of the national championships in the 70s. That was amazing. And Mike Bass was coaching Bruce Penhall. And I believe that that was actually one of the biggest benefits in Penhall's young career, is being coached and mentored by Mike Fast Bass. He just is an amazing rider, like I said. And then he could coach Bruce Penhall, like how to do things, how to win. You know, they were teaching, I guess Mike Bass rode with, I guess, Gene Woods, and then Gene Woods was an outside rider and Mike Bass was a pole rider. So it was either Mike Bass would get gate number 1 and Gene Woods would get gate 3, or it would be Mike Bass on gate 2 and Gene Woods on gate 4. So Gene Woods always had the outside, and Mike Bass, the pole rider, always had the inside. And Bass would help. And Bruce Penhall got to ride. I forgot who he rode with, but he got to learn, you know, from Mike Bass how to race and how to race the team, which actually, when he went to England and Europe, he actually benefited because he was actually being tutored by a master before he went over to England. So that was kind of an advantage that Bruce Penhall admitted that he had. And I saw that, and that was really great, you know, for Bruce to have that experience, to be mentored by the master, Mike Bass. And Bruce, of course, he went along for some pretty big fame in his life. And so that was really great. And Bruce, like I say, he went over to England. He had all that experience. He won the 2 world finals, and he would leave the friendly confines of Southern California, and he would go to the harsh weather of England and all throughout Europe, lots of rain, cold weather, food that, you know, he's not used to. And Bruce had a real cultural shock because, you know, Bruce was a pretty boy. I told him that. I said, you are like a glamour boy. I don't know if Bruce wanted to hear that or not, but it's true. You know, Bruce was like a glamour boy. He was a poster boy, and all the girls were in love with Bruce Penhall. And when I talked to Bruce about that, he seemed to be a little uncomfortable. He's like, I don't want to talk about it. And I said, I will talk about it because I know all about what happened. You know, like I was there. So you don't have to worry, Bruce. I will take your place. And he was laughing. So, but Bruce was really a poster boy, and everybody really enjoyed Bruce Penhall. I enjoyed Bruce Penhall too. One year I was cheering for him, and the next year I was racing against Bruce Penhall. I had won the promoter's son in a championship. The cup up there was a championship that I had beat the promoter's son of Costa Mesa. And I think they punished me every year for all. They would put me against the hardest racers, and I would always race against Bruce Penhall. So all the races, I'd open the program. Who am I racing against? Oh, Bruce the Fox Penhall. Oh, good. You got a race against Bruce every time. And Bruce was hard. You know, that guy was fast. I have some stories to tell, but maybe I'll save that for another show. But Bruce was good. That guy really was a hard charger. He was a really hard guy to beat. You know, Bruce Penhall, he didn't become a 2-time world champion for nothing. And back in 1980 and 1981, after he'd gone to England a little bit, we're not going to talk too much about England on this show. We're going to talk about his young days, his California days, his youth. And we're going to talk about that on this show. But when he came back from England for just special match races, I guess it was actually the United States Championship, Bruce Penhall came home and he raced in the national championship in 1980 and 81. And he won both of those United States championships, back-to-back United States champion, Bruce Penhall. So Bruce ended up eventually having 2 world championships, and Bruce Penhall had 2 American championships. He had Best Pairs Championship with Bobby Schwartz, and he had a whole list of other championships. I mean, he had a big list. And Bruce didn't race that long. I think it was only 7 years or so, maybe 10 years. I don't know. It was like just a few years, really. And Bruce, he accomplished so much in those few years. Most riders wish they could do that in a lifetime. So Bruce did, in a lifetime, but in just a few years, and that was really sensational. And Bruce said he didn't really want to be a 10-time world champion. He just wanted to win the world championship, and he did it. And then he did it again. So then he ended up retiring, as we all know. But Bruce didn't really want to be like Ivan Majors and race like 21 years and win, 6 world championships. He didn't really care because his goal was to win a world championship and to be a world champion. And he accomplished that goal. So he said, what do I want? I don't, what else do I want? I did my goals. And, racing's hard. Racing in England is hard life. You travel 150 nights a year. You live in these cold conditions at the beginning of the season. And, the tracks are hard. They're long. It's fast racing. There's a lot of pressure. All those championship events. I mean, you get tired. Bruce was like, he said, I'm like an old man now, like my body's tired. And because he really worked hard for those years. And so I don't know if his body would hold out all those years or not, because, he really was, racing a lot, and he was successful. And he was one of the most dominant riders in the sport. And I raced Bruce one of my other races, the first division races in Ventura. And I was really, I had to race Bruce. I had a good night that night. It was in one of my blogs. And I was in the main event, the handicap main event. I was on like the 10, I think, and Bruce was on the 40 or 50. And I knew I had to race because it was like the Moran brothers. It was like Bruce Penhall. It was all these legends. And I just knew I had to ride fast. So I ended up winning that race. Bruce almost beat me, though. Bruce Penhall always gives you a run for your money. And I don't have the picture right now, but I have a picture of me and Bruce riding. And Bruce is on the outside, and I'm just like hard charging on the pole. And I ended up getting lucky and beating Bruce. But, even if I beat Bruce at that handicap main event at Ventura, but it was really hard. And I went home and I was so tired. And even to this day, I remember how tired I was beating, having to compete against the Morans and then Bruce Penhall, and then actually having success, a rare occasion, but I had success against those guys. And it really wiped me out. It wasn't very funny. It was like happy, but I was exhausted. I thought I was going to need a week sleeping or something, because those guys are good and they give you a run for your money. And when you ride those guys, you have to give it your best shot. I mean, you have to go all the way. And for like 3 or 4 laps, Bruce Penhall was trying to pass me on the outside. And I had to go faster and faster because Bruce Penhall is fast. And if you just blink and Bruce Penhall's by you. So, it gives you a lot of stress to have to go that perfect. And I was able to do it because I had a little bit of experience at that time, a few races in D1 under my belt. So I was not going to be denied. And Bruce, give you a run for your money and pushes you all the way. Bruce Penhall was a champion even before he became a champion. He was good. That guy was tough. So that was kind of fun. And, Bruce Penhall was racing mini speedways from an early childhood and all the way to superstardom in America. He was surely one of the most popular riders in American history and talented speedway riders in America during those times. I mean, Bruce was just amazing. He was good. And so tonight we honor and respect the legacy of Bruce the Fox Penhall. And we're going to have Bruce on for another show in a few weeks. So if you saw the first one and liked it, we're going to do one in 2 or 3 more weeks. And we're going to talk more about England, Europe, and hopefully we're going to see his new motorcycles. He has some world championship motorcycles in his garage. And we're going to chit chat with Bruce Penhall about his days in England and Europe. And we're going to kind of like dive into a little bit about what happened there and what made him the world champion that he was. So it's going to be a lot of fun talking to Bruce the Fox Penhall in a couple weeks. So you want to stay tuned. And also, if you want to subscribe to the Speedway channel, we do a lot of Speedway live streams, and every day we have United States champion Aaron Fox coming on, and we have so many riders and stuff that we're going to be doing interviews with. And so you might want to subscribe and ring the notification bell so that you're notified of some really great shows that we have, including Bruce the Fox Penhall is coming on the show in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that, and you won't want to miss it. And we're just so happy to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Hive, and we appreciate it. And we're going to do that part 2 on Bruce Penhall, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Bruce is really a neat guy. He's cool. So we're going to have some fun with Bruce in the Hive. So you won't want to miss that one, Bruce Penhall. Have a good day. Stay on 2 wheels and be safe. And we will see you next race.